Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with my Gameweek 15 cheat sheet preview. Now, this video comes, of course, a little bit earlier, just due to the fact that there's a very short turnaround within this game week, and I don't really think the impacts of Tottenham and Brentford will really change my estimations on players, nor will they really change it within the Arsenal and United game. The key thing with United, of course, is that they're still subject to another managerial change where Carrick is probably going to be a takeover for one more fixture or two more fixtures before Rangnick comes in due to his visa issues. And then when we look across the pond to Tottenham, I still think that you've pretty much got these Tottenham assets at least for the run up until maybe United's fixture swing. So it still makes sense to evaluate these Spurs assets as having good games. It doesn't really change too much. With Brentford, of course, I don't think my opinions on their players have changed. Really, the only interesting asset for me still is Tony, who has good game weeks in the near future. So my mind isn't really going to change on that, and I expect him actually to blank this week. But let's actually move on to the defenders and get started with this week's video. So with Lamptey, I actually have risen him to basically the top. I don't think that Brighton have good fixtures, if I'm going to be completely honest, but I think Lamptey is a great hedge towards someone like Sanchez if you no longer own Sanchez, and especially since everyone is going to be switching to probably Ramsdale in the near future or De Gea, who are probably two of the most reasonably well-priced players who either play for a very solid team right now in terms of a defensive point of view for Arsenal, or have a fantastic fixture run ahead, and you have high estimations for due to the managerial change and things like that in De Gea. For me, Ben White, of course, is a great 4.4 asset. I have no idea why he's trending towards actually decreasing in price. It might just be the case that people are interested in other Arsenal assets, such as Tavares or Tomiyasu. But I think with Tavares, you have much little staying power. He might be a transfer ahead, especially if Tierney finds his way back into the side. And then Tomiyasu, I actually don't think is producing enough from an offensive point of view to warrant really an additional amount of budget, being put into him. As opposed to a Ben White in your team. With Lamptey, I would say he just looks exceptional right now. The only issue is that he gets rested quite often, and we saw this week in the midweek where he was rested but actually managed to bag an assist, and that's going to be one of the things you will have to deal with during this period where they look to rest Lamptey. But I think he is clearly a bright light for this Brighton side, and you can kind of probably pick the right fixtures to play him. Just because he's going to be your fourth stroke fifth option. I don't think he's going to be a consistent playing fourth, but if you have him in that kind of Livramento spot, or if you're, for example, moving away from someone like Cody and you don't really want to go more than three at the back, then clearly Lamptey is a fantastic option to actually have in your team, in my opinion. Paired with them should really be Ben Johnson, especially with the impacts of the Cresswell injury and him actually probably displacing Soufal from that right back position. I would say that Ben Johnson's a fantastic pick. He's also much cheaper, which means that you probably have budget to spend across your midfield and forwards if that's something you really want to do. As opposed to looking at Livramento, for example, who has dropped in price this week. I would say Livramento, unfortunately, just hasn't looked that interesting from a defensive point of view. I think a lot of us were looking at him as a very promising right back, and I think he is. But from an FPL asset point of view, I just don't think Southampton are creating enough chances where he is part and parcel to Southampton's attack, if that makes sense. And due to the kind of lack of extensive offensive roles that he plays, even though he occupies quite high positions in the pitch, I just don't think he'll get enough displays to be worth it as an asset, especially when Lamptey is comparably in I would say, a better defensive team, and then also probably contributing a lot more on attack. Basically playing as a right winger at times and actually creating chances across and very key chances as well. Whereas Livramento hasn't really had many opportunities to provide chances since arguably the Newcastle game where he had a sitter of an assist provided to Gineppo. And he's also, of course, scored a header since then, but nothing that would say that he's a consistent attacking threat. On top of that, I think Southampton's defensive stats have clearly fallen off a cliff. We've seen Benderek actually score quite a few lately, but McCarthy has been a bit suspect, and overall the defense and the defensive stats underlying them haven't been good for Southampton, and for that reason he falls. With Duffy, same reason why a lot of players fall. He's simply been put out of the rotation and doesn't really belong anywhere near your lineup at this point in time, especially since he's filling basically what would be a bench spot. With the Wolves defenders, they have to fall. 3 clean sheets in a row, fantastic run of games, especially from a player like Cody in my own side. But they have to fall because if you actually look at the Wolves fixtures, they're undeniably bad. You're playing teams like Liverpool and City in the next few games. It's basically a sea of red, even or notwithstanding how you think about FPL Ticker's difficulty rating. I just think Wolves have a very, very poor run ahead, and this is going to be the tough part of their season, as we've gone past most of the green now. With Guehi, he stays as a differential, nothing too exceptional there. And if we just move quickly across to the 5.3 and 5.9 players, I would actually say that there's been a lot of movement here, because I think we've probably given enough justification, to fall Alonso and Rudiger. Alonso and Rudiger just haven't been that interesting, and Chelsea's run is still going to be, I would say, a little bit tough in the near future. Missing out Chilwell is a big hit from the offensive potential. Rudiger has actually had many opportunities to score. Maybe Rudiger can still be considered as the best option, but Alonso has been rather dismaying, and I would actually say that he probably was the wrong transfer to make. As I said, James is probably the better long-term transfer, and that's exactly why I transferred him in Gameweek 14, because I didn't really see enough from Alonso in the United game that would tell me that he's going to play consistent minutes, and even if he does, that he'll be providing the same attacking returns that Chilwell used to. So that's why I think I've kind of dropped them in contrast to James, who stays as the best player, just because I think some people are now looking at the viability of looking into maybe strengthening the midfield as opposed to the defense. And even if you go for at the back, I think Alonso, Rudiger, and Diaz are all great options. I just would say that the priority, of course, is just to have James, Trent, and Cancelo, and that's why I just wanted to make that clear. It's not necessarily the fact that I think Chelsea is a terrible defense now, because they've lost 2 clean sheets in a row, but rather just to highlight that I think there is a bit of a difference in hierarchy between James, Trent, Cancelo, and the rest. Cresswell falls due to injury concerns. Walker falls due to rotation concerns. Obviously, we've seen Zinchenko come and play in the Aston Villa game, and he did all right, nothing exceptional. I think clearly in the tough games we'll see Cancelo play at left back, because I actually think he contributes a little bit more actually from this left back position as well. I don't know how Pep really feels about that himself, but even looking at the Aston Villa game today, I would say he was less drifting into the midfield and less having the ability to kind of stake his claim on the game, and was played almost as an option out wide, and was much less active in the game. So that's my one worry for Cancelo, but he still remains at the kind of point and position. Diaz, for me, rises just due to the fact that City's fixtures are turning very, very good, and you basically do want to have Diaz considered as a fourth option right now, especially since Cancelo is close to injury, and it's going to be swings basically back and forth between, I would say, the Chelsea defense and the Man City defense, where both these teams will get a run of maybe 3 to 4 clean sheets in a row, and you'll suddenly think you're on the wrong defenders, and part of it too is capturing them in the right fixtures. We picked Chelsea defenders over their best fixtures. Now City probably have better fixtures, and it makes sense to go into Diaz if you're looking for a fourth defender, to be quite honest. But whether you actually have to go for Diaz is another question. I think maybe Cancelo is good enough, because we've also seen City lose their clean sheets quite often, and you're not going to get a Diaz haul like you did today every week. With Robertson, he rises just because I think he's actually been informed. We mentioned that he has been much less active from a defensive point of view lately, but the fact that he's had 3 assists in 2 games is a very, very good start. And he's also much cheaper to Trent. I wouldn't advocate moving away from Trent now, but clearly Robertson is one to look at in the near future, especially since I think Jota has locked down that 3rd place spot as a Liverpool midfielder in the team. You probably want to be just deliberating between Trent and Robertson, but it's a very luxury transfer to make, and I wouldn't say it's guaranteed because there's so much value as well in Trent. If we move on to the midfield, Gallagher is someone who falls. Unfortunately, he has to fall just because I think he hasn't been active enough in terms of offensive positions. You'll see that due to the injuries that Crystal Palace have had, especially with Anderson and MacArthur, that Gallagher was essentially playing defensive mid the other day. I also think that there was a bit of rotation for some reason with Benteke not playing. I just feel that Crystal Palace seem to be much more effective when they're playing a little bit on the counter, even though they actually dominate possession versus a lot of sides. Gallagher is someone who is very, very good in transition, and when he makes that kind of run bursting down the field, that's when he actually creates this kind of offensive play. But if he's playing so deep, you won't really see these opportunities, and that's kind of my worry, especially when they're kind of faced against relatively easier fixtures and parked buses, where I think by ironically he would actually probably haul a little bit less than, for example, in the City game, where they're catching City in transition because City have lost the ball in a key area, and he's able to carry the ball across or be a part of a instrumental counter attack. And Boom and Gray stay in their positions. I do know that Gray obviously scored today, but there's just not too much going within the Everton camp. I think you'll see, for example, players like Richarlison and Gray and even Townsend Hall from time to time, but they just haven't been consistent enough in creating attacks. Yes, of course, they played Liverpool, but overall, the last 2 weeks, we just haven't seen enough from a defensive point of view for me to be interested. Dominic Calvert-Lewin, I'm still not exactly sure what's going on with his injury, and for that reason, I think Gray isn't going to be that effective. We actually also have to note that Gray was the most effective when Dominic Calvert-Lewin was still playing, and part of that too is having a central threat that can actually drive defenders away from you, allowing you to actually create space and make great runs, which Gray actually did today versus Liverpool. Whether he actually finds his way back into some of our sides is another question. I think Everton have to step up first before we make a move towards Gray. Rafinha, Cornet, for me, they still stay the same. I think Cornet still has pretty good fixtures for the near future. Rafinha, of course, is about to end his fantastic fixture run, and I might have to downgrade him soon, but you still have Brentford next, and it should be a good game for Leeds, and both sides really to score, in my opinion. And Rafinha has been an extremely instrumental player for Leeds. I think he was very fortunate to get the penalty that he did, but the reason why you keep Rafinha is because he is that kind of talismanic player for Leeds, and you have faith in him over at least what should be a good fixture run. It's going to come to an end, and I think there is going to be 100% considerations to move across to some of these players further down this list as other players have better fixtures or in better form. And that's exactly why I'll talk about Maddison, right? Because Maddison is clearly the most informed player in this kind of price category. He has, I think, 6 goals and assists in the last 3 games, and that includes European fixtures too. But it's clear that there has been a bit of a tactical change with Rodgers, and Maddison is basically finding his footing once again in the league. Shoutouts once again to FPL Mate for making a wonderful move to Maddison this week, anticipating a great game where he got 3 bonus points. But Maddison, as we know, is going to be that more creative player, especially when Tielemans is out. Maybe that is also part of what has impacted this Leicester team as well. It depends, I think, as well with their fixtures. I'm not exactly sure if Leicester will be able to contain or keep up this kind of form that they've had from an offensive point of view, because they've been scoring a lot of goals lately, but we have also seen them struggle versus some better defenses, and that's kind of my main concern as they head into tougher fixtures. I think there's a good gap and kind of window to capitalize on a few Maddison fixtures, but it might be very soon before we actually think about moving away from him, and that's kind of my worry. Maybe if you actually have that kind of luxury, you can go into Maddison and then move into someone like a West Ham midfielder in the near future, but that's how I see things. Trossard, he falls. I just think Brighton, they just haven't been that interesting, where I always think that these Brighton assets are differentials because you can't guarantee who's going to haul in each specific week, and they always do tend to be a little bit unclinical as a team. So we've seen, for example, Mopé miss a key chance the previous week, then score a screamer this week. Trossard was, of course, fantastic versus Liverpool. He looked the part and then scored versus Newcastle, and since then we've not seen much from him. My main worry, I think, with Brighton is that you're probably better off with more consistent assets, such as their defenders like Lamptey, who we know provide a consistent threat on a game-to-game basis. Whereas with the forwards, it's really a mix where you don't see much, and maybe someone like McAllister comes off the bench and provides, as opposed to anyone else. We've seen them also score very, very few goals this season and very late in games. So for me, Trossard just doesn't seem that interesting right now, especially since Maddison's in form, and arguably the West Ham fixtures are too good to pass up in the near future. Bowen and Fornals. Bowen, of course, was sitting on my list as a differential last week, but I've added Fornals in this week. Fornals had once again another contribution. The weird thing about the West Ham midfield is going to be, once again, picking the right midfielder for the right run. And of course, probably the next few weeks is going to be where we eye test. I think the Burnley game is a good game as well for us to kind of justify who we'd like to go for, whether we keep Bowen, whether we keep Fornals in our minds, or whether we even drop Antonio so we can just stick with one West Ham asset. It was great for us when we started the season with 2 West Ham assets, but I really can't say that there is a priority or a need to really do that at this point in the season. Mount is someone who inserts himself into this list. Chelsea have also been suffering from a lot of injuries in terms of their midfield. Ziyech seemed to have gone down as well in the Chelsea game. I think Mount will benefit, especially since he's come back from his kind of illness and a little bit of bad patches in form where Tuchel has benched him. But hopefully he can kick on, and that's kind of my worry, because he's done it before where he had this fantastic game with Norwich and then gets immediately hit by illness, and we don't exactly know what to do with Mount as an asset. A lot of people, I guess, knee-jerked into Mount at that time and then were burnt by it, and I'm sure a lot of people feel that way about Mount right now, but once again, it's probably just more of a wait and see. Mount is someone who we know can deliver the goods and has actually been very interesting from underlying stats. He leads Chelsea both in terms of expected goals and assists when you add them up. So for me, it's more of a case of whether he can actually back it up with consistent starts and consistent performances. Because this Chelsea side really should be overwhelming teams as long as they have the right midfield pieces. So it really depends on composition and players like Conte and whether they can find their way back into the team, because of course players like Saul have been struggling. Zaha falls for me. I just think that, kind of like what I was speaking with Gallagher recently, Crystal Palace have been somewhat hampered by their injuries, and they really just haven't been creating many chances. And Zaha's price is a little bit too much when we compare it to some of the other players in this list. So for me, Zaha just doesn't really justify his price, and that's kind of what I mentioned when we said to go Gallagher at the start. Ultimately, you're probably looking at equally talismanic players, but for different prices, and Zaha's much more expensive than Gallagher, so there's no real reason to look at him. And I probably have to fall most Crystal Palace players this week, because of the injury impacts and how their playing style has changed in recent memory, where they just haven't been that interesting. I think a side that isn't able to create clear-cut chances versus Leeds is unfortunately what we have to consider to be a poor side at this point in time. We've seen even a team like Tottenham, who've been struggling, find their way to score versus Leeds, and that's kind of my main concern with Crystal Palace at this point in time. Foden falls. I think Foden is probably going to be back this weekend, and if you're a Foden holder, I think you're in a fantastic position, but it just is once again a shout out to, let's say, Bernardo Silva, who had a fantastic performance this week, and the fact that maybe Foden will be rested over this point in time, especially since maybe his injury is a little bit worse than we expected. And as I said with Pep, I think he takes a very cautionary approach now with players, especially since he's learned his lesson from overplaying, in a sense, injured players such as Kevin De Bruyne in the past, and that's why Foden has dropped in my estimations for me, just because I think he could also be rotated, right? He could be rested. We saw that, I think, when he had a knock as well, right, in the Everton game, and getting a player subbed off at, let's say, 55 minutes, it's a huge burner. You don't really want someone who holds that much value in your team to be there, if he's not going to play consistent minutes. I think this is kind of crossroads where you either make the decision to drop Foden this week if you haven't already, or you just keep him, because it seems like the fixture run is fantastic and he should capitalize on it himself. Rashford is someone who I've added to the list. I just think prospectively, when Rangnick will come in, Rashford will play a part, and the United fixtures, in terms of how green they're going to be and how easy they're going to be, are going to come through quite thick and fast. And with Rashford as well, for me, at the end of Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's tenure, he looked quite good from his substitute appearances and looked very incisive. I wonder what kind of role he'll play in Rangnick's system, and I wonder what Rangnick's system will be in the first place. But I'm basically just putting Rashford preemptively in this kind of avoid list for now, just so that he's kind of in our minds and we think about him. Of course, Sancho is sitting there as a differential. He's a little bit cheaper and has looked very good in recent memory, but this was also under Carrick, and we know things can change as managers change. Going into the forwards, however, we'll see that Pukki actually is the one who rises this week. Dennis and King still kind of contain their positions from previous weeks. The issue with Dennis and King, I think, if just before I touch on Pukki, is just that Dennis might go to AFCON, because I think he's been in such exceptional form that I'm sure the Nigerian national team will call him up. Whereas King clearly is the player who has better underlying stats, is nailed on with penalties, and is a little bit more pricey. So that's going to be the difference between Dennis. But I just really think that Dennis passes the eye test a little bit more than King. We've seen King haul exceptionally versus Everton, but Dennis has been a much more consistent hauler game to game, and we saw him do fantastic versus a great Chelsea defense. Really doing his best versus Rudiger today in his goal, and I really think you can't deny Dennis and his potential run even before AFCON. We have many game weeks, as I said, before the AFCON fixtures roll around. There are 3 games where maybe you can just afford to put Dennis on the bench. Yes, there are 3 nice games for Watford, so maybe at that point in time you might even want to switch to King just to kind of capitalize on the opportunities. But I'm sure, for example, let's say a team missing Dennis and potentially missing Sarr as well is going to be a very hampered team. You probably don't even want Watford assets during that period, right, until they come back. So why not just capitalize on Dennis? Hwang falls, but just before I touch on Hwang, I think Pukki has to rise. Pukki has been very talismanic for Norwich, and that's exactly what I was saying with when Dean Smith would come in. I think it's a case about finding an identity and a clear way to score. He scored a very tough volley this week, and I wouldn't say it was a very well-built chance from Norwich. In fact, I think it was more really to celebrate the smarts of Pukki himself and his kind of positioning. And this Norwich side had a very poor game last week, but I think Pukki is finding his form, and at least they're finding their way to work the ball into the enemy box and create some sort of consistent chances versus the opponents. Of course, it's not a good look to actually just secure a 1-1 draw versus the worst team in the league in Newcastle. but it's something, and it shows that Pukki is still at least a very consistent player at this point in time, and someone that we can't really doubt. Hwang, however, has just not been incisive, decisive, or anything at all. Hwang has been incredibly boring, very few shots on target. We've seen Traore probably be a little bit more interesting than him. And overall, I think that this Wolves team have really lulled in terms of creating chances, and that's exactly why we'll see him as a differential at this point in time. And as we mentioned from the top with the Wolves defenders, the Wolves games are getting incredibly hard. I don't really expect much from Wolves during this period, and ultimately they have to fall. Armstrong also falls because I think Southampton's fixtures are getting worse. We've also seen them struggle to create. One thing that I mentioned in the podcast, I think, that I had with Pete was simply the fact that Southampton have been very unclinical. They've also not built too many chances overall. And they've clearly been on a bit of a downtrend as of late, kind of relying on more outside chances such as Benarek. And they just haven't been consistent whatsoever. And when we have options like Dennis and King who look fantastic, or players like Pukki who seem to be in great form, I think you can't pass them up. And clearly there's probably going to be a time now to actually move out of Armstrong. With Wilson and Watkins, those players have both risen this week. We had them as differentials mostly because these forwards, I would say, are arguably a little bit overpriced. With Watkins, I think the goal versus City was fantastic to see. Wilson, the same with the penalty versus Norwich, especially in a game where you don't expect him to hold due to the impact of the Clark red card. Overall, though, it was a great kind of game week for both of them, and they're both running into a kind of fixture run that is, I would say, very average. But then again, not many forwards have good fixture runs whatsoever at this kind of price range, or are they in form? Antonio is someone who is exceptionally off form. He's someone who falls for me on this list. I think I felt him last week, so maybe I have to change that. But clearly Watkins is someone who is on the rise and in form and definitely benefiting from the manager change. Aston Villa looked very, very good in the second half. They excited me a lot playing versus the City side, and I imagine that they'll do well for the time being under Gerrard as the fixtures get a little bit easier. But they still have tough games. I just think Watkins is a very good differential at this point in time versus the league, versus Antonio, who still has crazy high ownership. Wilson, the same with him, where he's a differential at this point in time, but he's been talismanic, and we know that even though Newcastle have barely scored any points on the tally for the season, Wilson has been very instrumental and has been a very good asset and very consistent outside of his injuries. If we move further down the list, because I don't think much has really changed with the key forwards, and I don't think I'm going to raise Kane, for example, to a best player this week, regardless of whatever performance he has versus Brentford, because the fixtures do get slightly worse, and we know Tottenham haven't shown us enough really. They would need more performances for me to actually rise him. With Vardy, it's similar, where we have one good week and then one subsequently bad week, and he doesn't look that exceptional. Leicester probably have had some nicer games, and then it gets rough. So that's kind of the issue with Vardy. And Ronaldo is at an extremely high price, so that's kind of his big problem for me when he looks at maybe like occupying a lot of spaces and value in people's teams. I think he's also dropped to 12.3, but it still doesn't really justify, I think, right now picking him, especially since he'll have to be rotating maybe game to game due to the midweek games that we have in December and the very tight schedule we have. You might see Ranić, for example, bench Ronaldo at points in time, and that would definitely not be something you'd like to have from a 12.3 asset. If we move to the keepers, Guaita is someone who falls. I just think, as I said, with Crystal Palace, they've just not looked that good lately. Their underlying stats defensively are great, but you also have to say that if there's a recurring pattern, for example, this team losing and conceding a lot of goals in the dying stage of the game, losing their clean sheets, you have to say that there is a bit of a pattern, and you have to kind of respect that. And as a Guaita owner myself, I'm not very confident about Guaita, even though his fixture run is very, very good post-United. That's why I'm potentially considering moving into Ramsdale or even De Gea, who, as I said, and as you can see on this list, is a rise for me. I just think that I'm preempting that De Gea has fantastic fixtures. I really struggle to see how they can't perform any better than they did under Ole, and I think De Gea will have a good run of games where hopefully his backline will not be as fraudulent as they really have this season, and I have the confidence that they'll do that based off of how much effort was really put in the Chelsea game. I think a lot of people have been talking about whether United have been playing with effort, and part of that is just the fact that this side is overwhelmingly good on paper, and there's no reason for them to really have as poor results as they've had. We've seen, of course, that Ole probably isn't the most tactically competent manager in the world, but at the same time, we've seen them do good in the last 2 seasons, good enough to at least put themselves in top 4. Right now they're sitting at 10th with a game in hand versus Arsenal. But I can't imagine it could really be much worse, and that's pretty much my basis to say that De Gea should rise over the next few weeks from that kind of point of view. So thanks guys for watching this week's cheat sheet preview. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and do captain Salah when you have the chance.